The 90s were probably one of the absolute best decades for video games. So many new franchises were born here, and other older series often had what's regarded as their best entry in this period too. The only time frame, at least in my opinion, that might have been better is the 2000s or the noughties or whatever you want to call it, but even then there's a good argument to be had that the 90s was still better. So to celebrate all that this decade had to offer, I've put together a list of the top 10 video games released in the 90s. Of course, this list is going to be fairly biased. I mean, it's based on what I've played, what I enjoy, and what I consider to have had the biggest impact on the industry as a whole, so definitely let me know if you disagree with any of my choices, and what your picks would be as well. And without any further delay, let's get on with it. Number 10, Spyro 2, Ripto's Rage. We're kicking off this video with potentially the most out of left field choice on the entire list. I'm sure a lot of people appreciate that Spyro is pretty good, but probably wouldn't rate any of his games as highly as this. I actually think that the Spyro games are a little bit underrated though, and I would go as far as to say that Spyro 2 in particular is one of my favourite 3D platformers ever made. The worlds you explore have way more depth than the average video game level, featuring a ton of interactivity with speaking to the inhabitants, playing minigames, and coming across unique abilities. The bosses are quite challenging and actually end up feeling pretty epic, especially with the final boss. You gain powers throughout the adventure, which increases the sense of progression you feel and adds in a well-handled element of backtracking to certain levels. Plus, the graphics are stunning, not only being vibrant and each level offering a completely new theme, but being technically impressive too, not featuring any kind of fog effect like a lot of other PS1 games did, which really shows off the scale of the stages. I love this game and I think it deserves a spot on the list. Number 9, Metal Gear Solid. A lot of people would probably rank this one a lot higher, but for me, I do feel like Metal Gear Solid has dated a little bit more than some of the other games here. That isn't to say it's not worth revisiting, but you do have to put up with a certain degree of jank here that was ironed out in the future entries. However, what is present here was absolutely unheard of at the time. This is the game that a lot of people consider to be their first experience with a truly cinematic video game. It has full voice acting for every single piece of dialogue in the game, in-engine cutscenes which transition to FMV scenes for the added movie-like touch, and most importantly it told a story which was fairly mature for its time, criticising nuclear weapons and tackling more personal themes such as whether your genetics have a certain hold over who you are as a person. The gameplay itself was unlike anything seen before. Sure, we already had stealth games, the first Tenchu predates Metal Gear Solid, and there was even the original Metal Gear games too, but Metal Gear Solid took these concepts and perfected them to such a degree that it made it something special. Then add in the more wacky elements like identifying a character based on the way they walk, or plug in the controller into the second port to more easily defeat a boss, or having to read the back of the game case to discover a code needed to progress the story, or having to go through a torture scene by being forced to mash a button for an extended period of time. Stuff like this was rarely seen in video games and made Metal Gear Solid turn from a great stealth game to something much more than that. Number 8, Super Metroid. Super Metroid took what made the original NES Metroid and Metroid 2 Return of Samus for the Game Boy so great and dialed everything up to 11. The graphics are some of the best on the SNES, the controls are way more responsive, and you have access to many more abilities. The soundtrack is atmospheric and almost scary at times, the story is more engaging with more obvious sprinklings of lore, and even to this day this is probably the best Metroid game in the series. One of the main ways this improves on the original games though is the inclusion of a map. This makes it so much easier to keep track of where you are and progress through the game, and honestly I find it almost impossible to play the older games without this. It features one of the most epic opening sequences on the SNES, and like Metal Gear Solid, it was one of the more cinematic experiences that you could get at the time. If you're a fan of what's come to be known as Metroidvania games, or if you're a fan of 2D indie games like Dead Cells, Rogue Legacy or Hollow Knight, you owe it to yourself to go back and play Super Metroid. It's an example of a game that's aged almost perfectly. This could come out now and nobody would even question it. Number 7, Super Smash Bros. Listen, I'll admit it, I'm not a big fan of fighting games. So while stuff like Street Fighter, Tekken and Mortal Kombat have always kinda passed me by, the one fighting game series I can get on board with is Super Smash Bros. You could make a case for the reason for this being that it's filled with Nintendo characters that I recognise, but I actually don't think this is the reason Super Smash Bros is so good. I actually didn't know who most of the characters were before playing this. I was a PlayStation kid, so for the most part my exposure to the wider world of Nintendo didn't happen until after I first played Super Smash Bros. The reason I kept coming back was just that the core gameplay is so great. The controls are very weird for a fighting game, but keep things accessible to newcomers while being versatile enough to have a huge skill ceiling. Each character, at least for the most part, has a completely unique moveset which makes each battle feel totally different, and the stages you fight on aren't just flat boring areas, they have verticality, they have dynamic obstacles, and they have pits to fall down. It's like a mixture of a platformer and a fighter, and I'm here for it. Even the way that you defeated your opponents was unusual. Instead of having a health bar, you have a percentage which goes up the more you hit and results in getting knocked further away the more the percentage gets higher. So it's about knocking the enemy off of the stage rather than simply battering them until they've got no health, which is not only distinctive as a core mechanic, but forces you to think more about your positioning than a normal fighting game would. Throw in a single player mode with a variety of gimmick fights and minigames, and even more unpredictability with items and weapons from a ton of Nintendo series, and you've got one of the single best fighting games ever made. Oh, and did I mention that you can have 4 players all fighting at once? It's pretty much the ultimate party game too. Number 6, Doom. I think we can all appreciate just how incredible Doom was at the time. It was by no means the original first-person shooter, but it's hard to deny that it was the best. The amount of weapons at your disposal not only made you feel like a badass, but were all balanced perfectly, with each one having its own strengths and weaknesses. The level design was maybe a bit too maze-like at times, but this did lend itself well to having you explore the areas, which added in a puzzle-solving element to the game. Despite the base version of Doom being amazing though, what truly makes it something special is the way that fans have continued to support the game by creating more levels, enhancing and modernising the controls, improving the visuals, and even crafting entirely new games from the Doom engine. There's probably some people out there who haven't actually ever played Doom for themselves, and to those people, I say you're missing out. Give it a go and you'll be hooked. Number 5, Crash Team Racing. Of all of the Crash Bandicoot games to feature on this list, this probably isn't the one that you'd expect. However, I think that this is not only the best Crash Bandicoot game ever made, but also potentially even the best kart racing game ever made. The only game that even comes close is Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and that's simply due to the sheer amount of content that's available in that game now. Crash Team Racing is not only an amazing multiplayer game to play with friends in the standard races, the battle mode and the cup races, but it also has a full-on single-player story mode featuring a massive hub world where you can access loads of different game modes. You've got standard races, sure, but you've also got boss battles, timed challenges where you need to grab all of the crystals before time runs out, races where you need to find hidden C, T and R letters hidden somewhere on the track, and time trial races where you can break boxes to freeze the timer, forcing you to decide if you should focus on straight up racing or if you should go out of your way to get the boxes for a potentially faster time. You've also got unlockable characters, battle mode arenas and difficulty options, which are amazing rewards for playing through all of the different modes in the game. It's like they thought of everything and wanted to give you an incentive to see everything the game has to offer. The main reason I think this is better than a lot of Mario Kart games though, in particular its main competitor at the time, which was Mario Kart 64, is simply that the controls are way better. You have a drift boost mechanic which gives you a lot of control over your turns and allows you to pick up speed quickly, and you have the ability to jump off of ramps and then pick up massive speed when you hit the floor, which makes the game flow insanely well. Mario Kart 64 by comparison feels sluggish, and that's a hill I'm willing to die on. Number 4, Resident Evil 2. The absolute champion of the survival horror genre in the 90s has to be the second Resident Evil game, right? Sure, the other Resi games are great too, and Silent Hill is almost certainly scarier, but Resident Evil 2 is a stone cold classic for a reason. It took the horror of the first game and brought it into a more familiar and grounded location, which added more realism to the situation. Instead of playing as a member of an elite police squad, you're either a rookie cop literally on his first day at work, or a literal citizen with no real combat training. It just made the experience much more relatable, and because of that, all the more scary. The graphics are pretty great due to using pre-rendered backgrounds, but I will admit that the character animations haven't aged all that great, and some of the dialogue can be very awkwardly delivered. But to be honest, I've always found this to add a B-movie charm to the whole thing, and I don't think it would be the same without this.
My chest! It's burning! What's wrong?
Something pretty unique at the time is that the game was split across 2 discs, with each disc corresponding to a different playthrough of the game as each of the 2 characters. Certain decisions you make in your first playthrough will affect things in the second playthrough, and there's brand new mechanics which present themselves on a second run of the game. The infamous Mr. X, made famous in the 2018 remake of Resident Evil 2, wasn't even featured in the first playthrough of the original game, making it all the more unexpected when he eventually did appear. Other than all of that, it's a fairly standard survival horror affair, consisting of careful resource management, a few jump scares here and there, a constant foreboding atmosphere, and lots of zombies to kill. What's not to like? Number 3, Super Mario 64. You knew this was gonna show up sooner or later. Yes, Super Mario 64 is incredible. I'm not the first to say it, and nor will I be the last. The thing that makes this game timeless is the level design and the controls working so seamlessly together that it's fun even to this day. Super Mario 64 was the showcase of how the N64's analog controls worked, and at the time, this was revolutionary. Sure, analog controls had existed before this, but they had never really been the total focus of a console up until this point. Nintendo had to nail the movement options at Mario's disposal, or the N64 would have failed in its main selling point. Luckily, they pulled it off, and the result is a game which feels way ahead of its time. Basically, every combination of moving, jumping, crouching, or attacking does something new. A jump crouch combo results in a ground pound, a jump attack combo results in a dive move, a jump followed by another jump results in a higher jump, a moving crouch into a jump results in a long jump. The way that all of these moves can seamlessly transition into each other gives Mario such a versatile moveset, and there was nothing like this at the time. They got it so right, in fact, that the movement options in Mario 64 still serve as the basis for his controls even now. Then you've got the levels, which are all completely open and non-linear, and allow you to discover and tackle different objectives in almost any order you want. The sense of discovery here is incredible, and need we speak about the hub world? Peach's Castle is one of the most iconic areas in video game history, and the sense of discovery found in the actual levels is also found here, with tons of secret areas and even entire secret sub-levels too. Of course, elements of the game have dated. The camera, for example, can be very irritating, but it's so easy to ignore the elements of the game that might not work as well as intended when the core experience is this polished. Number 2, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Ah yes, the 1-2 punch of Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time. Who would have seen that coming? Yes, this is another obvious one, but there's a reason this is always featured on these lists. Without Ocarina of Time, I don't think the landscape of video games as we know it today would exist. This is the game that inspired practically every single open world game ever made, and while Ocarina's open world isn't even particularly big, it's probably better than most of the barren open worlds that we see today. To be fair, it is debatable as to whether Ocarina of Time's world can even be considered open, considering that the main story is quite linear. But there are a number of side objectives which can be tackled whenever you want, and as the game goes on, even the main story does become slightly less linear too. So I would still consider it open world, personally. But enough about the game's impact. What's important here is that the game itself is still incredible. The sense of wonder you get here when exploring the land of Hyrule is incredible, and the story it presents feels like the first time Nintendo actually took the Zelda universe seriously, which led to them trying to haphazardly connect everything together with the previous games. The result of this though is that Ocarina has way more lore to discover, and the characters it presents are far more fleshed out than what was previously seen. The gameplay is extremely tight too, with most of the game revolving around discovering and exploring differently themed dungeons, which are filled with puzzles to solve and enemies to defeat. Each new area grants you with a new item, which adds to Link's ever-growing moveset, and as the game goes on, you'll find yourself having to use lots of these items in different creative combinations in order to make progress. It's an amazing adventure which deserves all the praise it gets, and even though I would probably argue that some of the newer Zelda games are better, the fact that this was the first 3D Zelda outing is insane. With both Mario and Zelda, they nailed it on the first attempt. Number 1, Pokémon Gold and Silver. Now I doubt any of you saw this one coming. Even if you guessed Pokémon, it's probably more likely that you guessed Pokémon Red and Blue, but let's be real here, Gold and Silver are better than the original games in almost every single way. Gold and Silver actually only barely make the cut for being in this video, and it's actually kind of on a technicality. In America and Europe, these games actually released in the years 2000 and 2001 respectively, which would have voided them for being included in this video. However, the original Japanese release was right at the end of 1999, and because of that, I feel like it counts. Pokémon Gold and Silver basically expanded on the formula laid out by Red and Blue in every way. You had the inclusion of the Pokégear, which acted as a phone, allowing you to have rematches with certain trainers you meet on your quest. You had a day and night cycle, which worked off of real-world time, changing the Pokémon you can encounter based on when you're playing. You've got 2 brand new Pokémon types with Dark and Steel. You've got a massively improved post-game where you can revisit the entire map from the first games. And not only does almost every single Pokémon from the original games return, but you've got 100 new ones too. There's also loads of quality of life changes that you probably take for granted, like the fact that you can see an XP bar fill up when defeating opponents in battle, the menu interface is way more organised and quick to navigate, and you can see if you've already caught a Pokémon during battle because of this ball icon appearing. Then you also had the debut of mechanics like Pokémon breeding and giving your Pokémon items to hold, which they automatically use when needed. Shiny Pokémon were introduced for the first time, and most Pokémon outside of legendaries were assigned genders. All of these new and expanded features make Gold and Silver not only one of the best Pokémon games ever made, and not even one of the best Game Boy games, but I would go as far as to say that this is one of the greatest video games ever made in general, and definitely deserves a spot on the list. But there we go, that wraps up my list of the top 10 video games released in the 90s. You might have noticed some really glaringly obvious omissions here, stuff like Final Fantasy VII, Chrono Trigger, and the original Half-Life for example, but the reason that I didn't include them on the list is because either I've not played them at all, or I've not played enough of them to put them on the list in good faith. So definitely let me know what games you would have liked to have seen included on the list, and if you agree with any of my choices. And if you wanted a different take on this subject, then definitely check out Seb Santabar Barbara's article over on the Retro Dodo website, where he breaks down his top 20 video games released in the 90s. For now though, I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.